The fleet that came out of FTL inside the Sol system was clearly not human. It was being led by some sort of battle/command ship. They had clearly come to party. The command ship was flanked on several sides by some sort of cruisers with over 100 smaller ships swarming around them. Before we even knew what was happening, the human fleet had already begun to move. Listening to the broadcast that came through my phone, I kept looking over at the incoming fleet. This fleet clearly wasn't for colonization. No, they came to pick a fight. As I put on my plate carrier, complete with new plates, I could hear the transmission in the background. The advancing fleet had sensed something that was being translated, yet I didn't have to wait for that, as Cammy and the two Scarlets turned several shades of dark before translating it for me. The message stated, "We are the Iverk. You will surrender the Glomtics, or you will be taken from you. You will stand down your weapons and surrender. This sector and all its resources now belong to the Iverk Empire. Submit to us, or we will be forced to remove your species from existence." As they finished this translation, the girls were almost charcoal black in fear. I paused what I was doing and went over to console them. Surprisingly, they had picked up a very human practice as they both shook in fear, almost violently. The expression on their faces was also that of sheer and utter terror. I held them for about a minute before the response from humanity came. It was, "To the Ivert Command. The response of humanity is as follows. If you want this planet, our ships, our people, and our allies, the Glomtics, come and take them." The girls were confused as I began to laugh hysterically at this response. All three of them looked at each other as they didn't understand why I would not stop laughing, no matter how many times they asked me why. Over the speakers, I could hear the announcement from the Space Command, and a general announcement to everyone else. "To all space-based units, midway, I say again, midway. To all terrestrial forces, prepare for incoming forces. Engage at own discretion." I know exactly what that meant, as the Space Forces would be keeping the carriers as far back as possible and letting the bombers handle the fight. We only had one battleship, unfortunately, but the amount of destroyers and frigates and corvettes that were guarding the carriers was going to make them feel the pain from multiple sides, as civilian space vessels would aid by getting the wounded out and resupply in whenever possible. For us on the ground, not currently in the military, that is, it was our job to scout and report and engage in harassment until the big weapons could show up. Setting everything ready, I opened the safe to get my weapons out. When I did, I actually called the girls over. I handed Cammy my .22 pistol and a riot shield that I had recently purchased. We had found out that the heat weapons would dissipate quickly upon reaching the strictly plastic surface. However, I had done a little more experimenting and found out that if you line both the front and back with mylar, no heat gets through at all. I burned up a lot of shields testing this out. Of course, I did share this information across the net, and I thought to myself, those scaly folks are gonna get a big surprise when they come down. To the twins, each I handed 22 caliber rifles, both loaded with the strongest 22 long I could get. Given the twins' size, though, I looked down and it was almost like children holding old school muskets. I made sure each of the girls was also outfitted with armor that looked more akin to riot gear with all the new plates attached to the body, yet did allow for full movement. I had to buy a lot of these plates as they were made of the same material as the new plates that I was carrying. The rifles are the strongest they can handle, but I had a little extra something. I had also purchased a semi-automatic chambered in 223. For a Glomtic, this is like handling a 10-gauge shotgun, but I still wanted them to have access to it, just in case those 22 long were not enough. I kept my phone on as I listened to the broadcast as I walked upstairs, went to the garage, and began to fuel up the ATV and make sure everything was topped off. In space, things had already begun. Both sides had deployed their versions of fighters, yet with very, very different designs. I looked on as different schematics came across, and I saw that Iverk were very small, single seat, kind of aerospace fighter design. Humanity went a different way, and they went with larger two-man fighters, each with much, much larger engines. With that, one could be confused at the look of these fighters, as they seemed to be much heavier, meaning that you would think they'd be slower. Watching the transmission, it was clear to see which ones were the faster of the two. The large fusion engines of the human fighters propelled them much faster than the enemy fighters did. Even though they were twice the size, that mass was just put to good use. Looking close, you could see that strapped to every possible sector are massive torpedoes designed to take out a destroyer or more with one hit. Taking cues of science fiction, each one is armored to cause maximum damage and survivability on its way to the target. In the center of the fighter sat a very large fixed particle laser, and each fighter had at least 8-point defense cannons ready to be put up a wall of lead and brass against the enemy. As the two masses of fighters got close, the human fighters fired first. Their large particle cannons pierced into the enemy like hundreds of red beams across the void of space. At that distance, the enemy had about 2.1 seconds to get the hell out of the way. Most didn't. The beams passed clean through the enemy fighters and continued to the first line of frigates and destroyers, and even some corvettes. Each beam piercing into the hull with mixed results. The enemy fighters are so busy taking evasive action that they do not realize that the wave of missiles heading toward them released by the fighters themselves, each carrying 4. The enemy began to thrust Vector out of the way and release their own countermeasures, and this caused the ratio to drop from almost 100% down to 48%. I chuckled at that percentage as I moved my screen so that I could back away from the battle to see the rest of it. Our one battleship, known as the Dragon's Breath, had gotten into position in between the fleet and the planet and began to line up for a full-on broadside. I knew it was in range, but they couldn't fire until the fighters finished their run. Realizing this, I went back to the fighters. Our flyboys had pierced the enemy fighters' line, and point defense cannons are glowing red as the onboard AI targets with extreme prejudice. Our fighters line up as they get within the enemy's targeting envelope. Simultaneously, they release another volley of particle laser and fire into the enemy formation, this time with devastating effect. Moments later, you can see the volley destroys or disables nearly 24 enemy ships. And with that, the fighters launch their torpedoes, and I mean all their torpedoes. On the readout, there are so many icons that they just seem to blur together in one big blob. Quickly, I switched back to a camera view so I could see the massive pile of torpedoes go into the enemy formation. As the enemy's point defenses began to fire, the torpedoes began to vector themselves so that they would receive minimal hits. Most of the hits barely did more than scratch the paint due to the heavy armor. In desperation, the enemy fighters began trying to catch the torpedoes, cranking themselves to speeds that apparently were almost too much for the fighters themselves, completely disregarding the human fighters that decide to flip and burn, using their fusion engines to create a cloud of superheated death on the other side of them. I laughed as the pause between firing the torpedoes and the igniting of the engines was seemingly deliberate. Not just to keep from destroying their own ordnance, no, but to make sure the enemy could not strike them at their most vulnerable point. straight up their ass. Yet the enemy did not have a chance. As their fighters lined up their shot, they suddenly found themselves inside the flash radius of the fusion engines, and they were simply turned into space-based fireworks as their own engines overheated and exploded. The human fighters bugged out, but in a way that looked almost like a flower opening up. For a moment, I thought they were just trying to scatter and get away, making sure they couldn't all be targeted at the same time. Nope. They were just getting the hell out of the way as torpedoes began to strike across the enemy's flank. It seemed like every single ship on the enemy's port side had just exploded. This included some of their larger destroyers, or were they cruisers? We didn't quite know. The fleet with the carriers began to fire as many as possible over and over. With all the confusion, the enemy didn't notice the waves of ordnance screaming in right behind the fighter wall. Several enemy ships were able to realize what was happening and defend themselves, while others fell victim to the barrages. Just as the enemy began to reform its line to protect its command ship, the Earth fleet had a surprise. Adjusting itself to bring the most turrets and fixed emplacements to bear, the dragon's breath finally breathed fire into the battlefield. In a stunning array of orange laser weapons, they pierced through the heart of the enemy fleet, sending beams of concentrated particles followed by tungsten rods directly towards the command ship. The large enemy ships at the core of the formation either did not call for evasive action or were unable to get out of the way in time as lasers and ballistics pierced the front of their ships and onto the command ship. With unrelenting fire, the captains of the Dragon's Breath fired without pause into the formation. The enemy's command ship shuddered and showed multiple internal explosions and then went adrift. But that was only for a moment, as the entire bow of the ship seemed to suddenly explode, forcing the massive ship backwards as its engines completely failed. This is when things really got interesting. It seemed that without their command ship, each vessel just decided to rush into the fire. Damn the torpedoes. Each vessel accelerated to flank speed and broke formation. Some headed towards the carrier fleet, while the rest began to rush towards the planet. As they charged, they fired, and our ships answered in kind. The Iverics must have thought the battleship was fighting alone. They didn't know that humanity hunts in packs. As the enemy fleet entered lunar orbit, the Dragon's Breath was moving away, seemingly to run. Nope, it was getting the hell out of the way, as the space defense satellites opened up with their own weapons. Undeterred, the Iveric fleet just kept charging into the fire, taking down the static satellites as they spun their own fire out. A whole lot of ships began to try and make planetfall at that point. Seeing this, I came back to my senses and got my head on the killing mode, as it should be. Turning, I noticed that the girls had actually come out and were actually watching what I was watching, as the whole battle seemed to unfold in front of us. I told them that things will be fine. Don't worry, it'll be fine. But they all still looked worried. Getting them all in the house, we finished preparations, and looking to the sky, I could see our own in-atmosphere fighters, mainly F-15s from the local base, heading out to rip the enemy a new asshole. There was also the occasional streak of a missile going up as well, although where it came from and where it was heading, I have no clue. With the house locked up tight and the animals tended, I sat next to the ham radio, waiting to hear it. With pen and paper in hand, I could wait to hear the grid coordinates. I waited, and then suddenly it was there. I listened close to wait for certain grid zone identifiers, and I wait impatient as more are read off. These are landing zones for the enemy, those that we know they're coming down. Suddenly, My attention is fully focused as the identifier I was waiting for came across the speaker. I immediately wrote it down as fast as I could, all 8 digits that were given. After all the grids were read off, I ran to the maps and plotted them out as fast as I could. I quickly realized one is going to be only one town over. I calculated the drive, 15 minutes by ATV. Since none of the landings are going to be any closer, this was going to be my target. I ran upstairs and told the girls to lock the door behind me, and one of the Scarlets tried to stop me and asked, "Why are you going to fight? Can't you just stay here?" Looking back to them, I said, "Keeping the enemy away from this house is the best way to keep you all safe. Besides, they didn't exactly come here to make peace with us, did they?"